Students, welcome back to another in our series of video lectures. We have concluded the Escape from Reason series. We now embark on the material that's in your textbook. If you do not have your textbook at this point because of voucher reasons or some other thing, please recall that you can rent the textbook for as little as $15, and I've left the link in a previous message and post for you on that. But having said that, we're just making you responsible for making sure you get your textbook as soon as possible. But for right now, you'll have this material to review and to study. And so in a course like Humanities, where the root word is what it means to be human, obviously we have to address important issues like life. And to do that, we have to talk about philosophy, and who better than the great philosopher Garfield. So let's look at Garfield here. This looks like a good place to sit and muse. So Garfield wants to sit down and think and contemplate some of the serious issues of life, along with his pal Odie there on the left. Garfield asked him, "What is this thing called life, Odie?" Montaigne said, "The value of life lies not in the length of days, but in how we make use of them." Holmes said, "Life is painting a picture, not doing a sum." James said, "Be not afraid of life. Believe that your life is worth living, and your belief will help create the fact." And of course, Odie is busy playing blissfully with the butterfly. And of course, Garfield looks at him. "Odie, sometimes I envy you." And so hopefully the irony and the point of this comic strip is not lost on you. Something for us all to think about, and that's why we've chosen the famous philosopher Garfield for this. If we're going to talk about the arts, we certainly have to deal with the big questions, because that's why artists create and do what they do. Many times they're responding to those things. Now, when we talk about modern art, I think this particular cartoon is really comical. Some people think of it like this, that somebody just smeared some paint on their face and dropped down face first into a canvas. It may look that way, but I think we're going to see as we go along that there's much more to it than even that, even though on the surface, modern art, as we refer to it, some forms of it may look almost accidental. And so as we embark on the introduction to your textbook, this is the arts and introduction, and so this will lay some really great groundwork for us. We want to first recognize that the arts are a widespread mutual experience. What do we mean by that? It's something that we all experience, both individually, and we can even experience it collectively. Think about the picture that we've illustrated here, a concert. People are all paying money, good money, coming together because they all want to experience something together. So think about the things that everyone mutually experiences, the kinds of art that they mutually experience there at a concert. And then also think about what people experience when they go to church, that there's similarities here. I'm not in any way saying they're the same thing, but there are things in common. So let's look at some of those things, some of the artistic mediums that a church and a concert share in common, and even opera. Some of you might say, "Well, I've never been to an opera. I don't plan on ever going to an opera." But an opera really is just a very long music video. There's choreography, there's dancing, there's costumes, there's music, there's a plot. We may not think of it that way, but an opera is just a very long music video. Now think about all three of these things have these in common. They include visual arts. When you go to a concert, and these other things as well that we've mentioned, there are visual things that are going on that heighten the experience. just the visual of the musicians performing and the light show and many of the things that come into play there. Obviously, there's literature. Some of you might like to buy a program when you go to a concert. There's literature in church, the program that they print up many times that'll have not only the order of the service, but maybe announcements and things of that nature. And then the same thing again with an opera. And obviously, it goes without saying, there's music in all three of those. And so it's really good for us to talk about how those might differ. And then a really, really big point that we want to underscore is notice how they're all integrated. In other words, by integrated, we mean we bring them all together, and that's what makes for a widespread mutual experience that really can be very, very profound. And that brings us to the types of art. We've already touched on that in the previous slide, but let's go more into detail. There's basically three types of art. Music is an example of this first one, a temporal art. Temporal art means it only exists as we hear it or as we experience it, and then it's gone. Now, because music is recorded nowadays and we have that kind of technology, we can play it again. So it's not like it's gone permanently, but it's only there and it's going by for as long as it's being heard. And that's why music is one of those temporal arts. Visual arts, on the other hand, and architecture are spatial arts. They have a permanent quality to them. Think about looking at a painting. It's there on the wall, and there's nothing temporal about it. It's not like it goes by and then it disappears. It's there for as long as you're standing in front of it and looking at it, and it doesn't go away as long as nothing happens to damage it or anything like that. Same thing with architecture. It has a frozen quality to it, and it takes up space, has a permanent quality, hence the term spatial art. And then the third type of art that we mention is literature or a word art. So we have temporal arts, spatial arts, and word arts. Literature is a combination of the above two that we've looked at because it has both a permanent and a temporal quality. Think about as you're reading through a book or a magazine, it's temporal to the extent that you can flip the page and then it's gone. All right? But it's permanently there on the page. The ink and the paper are always there. Again, as long as nothing happens to damage it or destroy it. So it has both a permanent and a temporal quality. So we'll divide these art types into these three basic types. Then we talk about something that some people consider to be a little controversial, a masterpiece. What really is good art? Now, some people might say, well, who's to say? It's like beauty. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Well, is that true? That's a good question to ask. But there's no doubt that some things have stood the test of time and they are considered to be masterpieces. That's why we call them a masterpiece. It was considered a masterpiece at some point in time, and it continues to be considered a masterpiece. Think the music of Beethoven. That may not be your favorite music, but it's still played by orchestras hundreds of years later. People still pay good money for tickets to come out and hear a good performance of Beethoven's Fifth, or Mozart, or many other music composers that we could name. And it's not just listed to what we might call quote-unquote classical music. The music of the Beatles has survived a long time, and many people think, 100 years from now, 200 years from now, their music will still be with us. So why can we call certain things a masterpiece and other things are really not considered of that enduring quality of a work of art? Well, I think one good point that your authors make there is that a masterpiece is a work that carries a surplus of meaning. In other words, we can see meaning on many, many different levels. And so it's very profound in that sense. Think about Star Wars and how profound it is in that it appeals to such a wide variety of an audience. Children can go see it and they enjoy it because it's a space shoot 'em up, and there's rocket ships and there's fight scenes and there's a hero and a villain and all these. It has a great appeal there. But then grown adults go to see it and they see different layers of meaning there, how it affects them, because you do see the classic good versus evil and messages there that reveal basic truths about us as a culture. And so when George Lucas wrote those movies and filmed those movies, he was tapping into that. And so he was a good writer and a good filmmaker. And so we call that today a masterpiece. It carries a surplus of meaning. And as we mentioned just now about George Lucas, it also reflects a certain technical and imaginative skill. And you see those techniques that were used in the original Star Wars movie. There were techniques that had never been used up to that point with the computer-generated graphics and things of that nature, and obviously his great imagination. It also sums up the best of a certain age. And think about that for a second, because people will use that as a model for everything made since that time. Think about how many movies have tried to copy Star Wars, and we'll give you another example here in just a second. It also becomes the reference point for every work produced since. And the reason why we have dome example here, we want to show you an example of that. Way back in the Renaissance, the Florentine Cathedral was designed and built by a genius architect by the name of Brunelleschi. Brunelleschi came up with a way to build this huge dome, much larger than anyone else in history had been able to build since then, because of the way that he was able to build these white supports that you see there on the dome. And that was so impressive to people that every dome built since that time, such as St. Peter's in Rome, St. Paul's in London, and of course, you probably recognize this, the Capitol buildings that exist both in our nation's capital and in our state capitals. We choose that type of architecture because they're very stately and they're very impressive. And even our sporting events are held in many times domed stadiums. The Dallas Cowboys play in AT&T Stadium, but it's covered by a giant dome. And so Brunelleschi has had a great influence on all the architects and the builders since that time. It has become a reference point for every work built since then. So as we look at these things and as we study them, I want to suggest 2 steps to studying the humanities. We want to look at the work in itself. In other words, just isolate it. Don't think about anything else other than asking yourselves, well, what is it that I'm seeing here? And what is it about this that makes this a masterpiece, if indeed it is a masterpiece? And you may even ask yourself, in your opinion, is it a masterpiece? But we also want to think about it in relation to history. In other words, do some research and ask ourselves, when was this particular thing composed? Whether it's a piece of music or a painting or the architecture like the dome we just looked at, or a movie like Star Wars. We should see it in the context of its time, because that tells us something about, it helps us to better understand the work. And it also, if we know something about the person who composed it, that will help us to know something about the work, because the artist is always trying to communicate something, and the artist is an individual. And so that's going to have a profound effect on it as well. So let's look at visual art first. How should we look at it? Well, all art, not just visual art, expresses human ideas and our emotions. That's why it hits us at that level. But we do need a reference point to understand. That's why understanding it within the context of history can certainly help. And also understanding, how is it that a person composes something like that? How does a person write a piece of music or paint a painting or these kinds of things? Think about visual art everybody's involved in visual art. You may think, well, I don't go to museums and I don't own paintings and things. Well, you probably have posters. If you don't have posters, you certainly